Going on, everybody? It is 5:47 p.m. on now Tuesday afternoon, July the 16th, 2019. And I was going to record this video yesterday, but we had a little bit of a work crisis, if you will, and my mind was not in a fit state to record this video, so I decided to put it off for a day. This week, for kind of my overarching theme for everything, and I'm using both hands because I'm waiting to pull out of the parking lot. For those of you who are worried I'm putting my life in danger, just a gesture, I promise you I'm not. So this week, the overarching theme for both this episode and for Homeward Path is going to be about doing things, or doing the same things but doing it in a different way. And there were a lot of ways I wanted to look at that, and most of those will be covered in the Homeward Path episode this week. But no deck that I have ever built, ever tested, ever seen played personifies that, like exemplifies that belief of doing the same thing but doing it in a different way, as well as Open the Vault's Control from 2010 standard. This was Shards of Alara block, so Shards of Alara, Conflux, and Alara Reborn, plus all of Zendikar blocks. So we had Zendikar, Worldwake, and Rise of the Eldrazi, and then I believe we had 2 core sets at that point. At the time I finally got my hands on the deck. I think I started working on it before we got the second core set. Or maybe core sets still rotated before the rest of the format. For the life of me, I don't remember for sure. But we had, you know, the mana was kind of awful. So, you know, being full-on Esper was difficult, but not impossible. But we were mostly blue-white. Black was a splash just to be able to pay the mana cost on one of our creatures. And then, otherwise, we were a blue-white tap-out control deck by design. Now, why is that important? Well, the format as a whole at that point was kind of in a weird spot. We had 2 mid-range decks that were at the top of the pile. You had Jund Cascade, which it goes down in history, in Magic history, as arguably one of the best decks of all time, at least as far as its reign of dominance over its standard format. Like that deck was the front runner from the moment Lorwyn rotated out of standard and Zendikar rotated in. That was the best deck in standard until the Alara cards rotated. So for a solid calendar year, if you were playing Jund, you had a chance to win any event you sat down at. And then late in the format, once we got, you know, Jace the Mind Sculptor and Zvi Moshewitz sat down and decided he was just going to break the standard format, we ended up getting Mythic introduced into the format. And when I say Mythic, I don't mean the rarity, I don't mean the gameplay variation or anything of the sort. It was another mid-range deck where Jund was more of a reactive one, where you had a couple of early proactive plays, but then your entire mid-game was about value. Between Bloodbraid Elf, Siege Gang Commander, Garruk Wildspeaker, Broodmate Dragon, Blightning was a 2-for-1, like Sprouting Thrynax was a 2-for-1, and then you had a bunch of 1-for-1 removal. And the way you won was on the back of just how many 2-for-1s your mid-game had. Mythic was a completely different animal. Mythic used a very, very robust mana engine. And when I say robust, I'm talking, this was a mid-range deck in standard that was playing 27 lands. 27 lands. And 8 mana dorks and Lotus Cobra. Interesting. So I want you to think about how much mana this deck made on average. The big secret for Zvi in building the deck was that a lot of other people tried to trim lands when they played Lotus Cobra, so they would make sure they would draw gas. Zvi was on quite the opposite, the opposite part of the spectrum there. What he figured out is that as long as you never missed a land drop and had 1 or 2 threats in your opener, thanks to some of the cards you were playing, you were able to just dominate the board. So the idea behind Mythic was where Jund was trying to take something away from you every turn or pull just a little bit ahead on card advantage. Mythic was about dropping just a singular card that would kill your opponent every single turn starting on turn 2. You wanted to Mana Dork on turn 1, into Knight of the Reliquary on turn 2, or into Lotus Cobra plus Fetch Land plus Explore, so that you could set up a 6-drop on turn 3. Like, these were not uncommon play patterns for the deck. Sometimes you would go turn 2, turn 1 Mana Dork, turn 2 Cobra, play Fetch Land, don't crack it, play Mana Dork, so that you would have extra mana on your next turn. Like, it was one of the craziest decks I've ever seen, ever. And the only way control decks were able to hang with all of this, because the counter magic was so bad in Standard at the time. Like, we had just gotten Mana Leak in M11. Other than that, the counter magic in Standard was horrible. We had Cancel, and we had Negate, and we had Flash Freeze, which was counter target red or green spell. That's what we had in Standard for counter magic. All the rest of it was awful. Essence Scatter was in the format, but it wasn't very good, because there were way too many good non-creatures, and you didn't want to play too many Essence Scatters. And we didn't have Cancel with stuff tacked onto it like we do now. We didn't have stuff like Disallow or Sinister Sabotage or Ionize or Absorb. We had just Cancel, and we had to play it because it was a counter spell. So eventually what the control decks settled on was just not running counter magic, because there were no combo decks to speak of at the time. So it turned out that the best way to be the control deck was just to tap out every turn and answer as much of your opponent's stuff as possible. You were the ultimate in reactive deck, where Drago says, I'm going to wait until you play it and then answer it before it becomes a problem. Tap out says, I'm going to let the problem happen and then deal with it. And the popular version of blue-white tap out at the time was way, way better than what we're talking about for Open the Vaults. But, we had Jace the Mind Sculptor, Gideon Yura, Celestial Colonnade, Day of Judgment, Martial Coup, Elspeth Knight Errant out of the sideboard, Baneslayer Angel, all these big, dumb things we could just tap out for that were just going to be better than what our opponent was doing. It didn't matter if they went Siege Gang Commander into Broodmate Dragon if you just had Day of Judgment, and you could wipe all that away in one fell swoop. Or if you had Martial Coup and would wait until you're 7 on the play to make 5 tokens and then kill all your opponent's stuff. That was a thing we could do, and we did with regularity. And, the handful of times I borrowed the deck when I was living in North Dakota, I had a lot of fun with it. But I was getting ready to move home, and I didn't have the cards for it, and I just could not justify that expense. I was getting ready to move. I was in college before I got ready to move. It's not like I had a great job, so finances were really, really, really tight. And I started looking around at alternatives to being a control deck in this blue-white shell, because I had the lands, and I had the board wipes. I had the Day of Judgments, I had the Martial Coups, I had Jace Beleren. I didn't have Jace the Mind Sculptor, I had Jace Beleren. And then a Gideon. And none of that was going to translate into a version of blue-white control that was going to be playable. And I kind of stumbled upon this thing as I was starting to get stuff together, and I made a note. I said, I'm going to revisit that when I get home, after we get moved. And what it was is someone stumbled upon the idea. It married a deck that I had played earlier in the Alara Zendikar format, like right after Lorwyn rotated. It married an idea that I had played then with the blue-white tap-out deck. So immediately I was intrigued because it was the combination of two things that I was comfortable with. What they did, the blue-white tap-out decks at the time, they were playing cards like Wall of Omens and Spreading Seas at 2 mana to hold their opponents off long enough for Day of Judgment to catch them up. And then from after turn 4, your end game was whatever your end game was. In regular blue-white tap-out, it was Jace the Mind Sculptor, Gideon, Celestial Colonnade, Baneslayer. And then once we got M11, Sun Titan. But for this deck, it was a little bit of a different animal. Because instead of playing, we were still in for Spreading Seas, we were still in for Wall of Omens. But instead of playing cards like Divination and Mind Spring in order to use turn 3 to just go up a card or two and try to pull ahead, we were playing cycling creatures. Most notably, the 2 cycling creatures we were playing were Glass Dust Hulk, which was 3 a blue and a white for a 3/4 that got +1/+1 whenever an artifact entered under your control, and would cycle for either a blue or a white. And then we were playing Architects of Will that was 2 a blue and a black for a 3/3 that when it entered the battlefield, you could rearrange the top 3 cards of target player's library. So, and then it would cycle for a blue or a black. And then in the Divination slot, we were playing Courier's Capsule, which was, or in the Mind Spring slot rather, we were playing Courier's Capsule, which was 1 in a blue artifact, 1 in a blue tap, sacrifice, draw 2 cards. So it was a net more mana. Like you had to spend a total of 4 versus spending 3 for Divination to draw 2 cards. But it was on par. It was the exact same mana cost total as a Mind Spring for 2, which is important for the purposes of this, because it would do the same thing as a Mind Spring for 2, but wouldn't, played better with what our end game was. Well, I talked a lot about the build-up. What's the end game? Well, the hint is in the name of the deck. It was Open the Vaults Control. Open the Vaults is a sorcery. I can't remember what set it was from. I think it was the core set. M11, if I'm not mistaken. M10 or M11. Maybe both. But for 6 mana, 4 and double white, each player returns all artifacts and enchantments from their graveyard to the battlefield. So for 6 mana, I could get back every Spreading Seas that got blown up. I could get back every Courier's Capsule that I'd activated. And I could get back every Architects of Will or Glass Dust Hulk that I'd cycled. And then what we stumbled upon, and the reason this deck got built, was the turn 5 setup card that led to this. Now this was a card I was playing in the deck, in a different deck previously in the format, to match up a little bit better with Jund. It was a deck that wanted to keep buying back creatures from the graveyard to the hand, and it was marrying with the cycling creatures. And then we played Sphinx of Lost Truths. Now, Sphinx of Lost Truths is horribly mana inefficient. It is 3 and double blue for a 3/5 flyer. And when it enters the battlefield, you would draw 3 cards and then discard 3 cards. Unless you paid its kicker cost, which was 1 and a blue, at which point you would just draw the 3 cards. Now, normally, you would be patient with that card. You would play it as a 1 of, and you would wait until you could get to 7 to play it. In this deck, it was like a 2 or 3 of, because it was one of the most powerful things you could do on turn 5 in this deck. Because you would draw 3, and then you would discard a capsule, a border post, and a filigree angel. Filigree angel is an 8 mana creature, and I think she's a 4/3 flying. It's not something you want to pay full retail for. But when she's coming out of your graveyard as part of your Open the Vaults play, she's really, really powerful in a format that has devolved to it revolved around creature combat. What she did is when Filigree Angel enters the battlefield, gain 3 life for each artifact you control. Now, you don't want to build around that card in the sense that you play a bunch of artifacts that you're trying to like play out for 7 turns and then just jam her on 8. You don't want to do that. That's not good. That's not a worthwhile investment in the card. But what we figured out is that Open the Vaults made it a worthwhile investment in Sphinx of Lost Truths. Because the Sphinx had a big enough butt to make sure we didn't die. You know, between Day of Judgment the turn before, or, you know, Day of Judgment or whatever other 4-drop, if it ended up being like a hard cast Architects, just to block, or just to eat their lightning bolt so it didn't go upstairs. You would stay alive. And then you would Sphinx, and Sphinx could block really well too, and that lets you live to turn 6 to cast your Open the Vaults. And once you cast Open the Vaults, you would gain somewhere around 18 life between cycling and cracking Courier's Capsule and then casting your Sphinx. And then we were also, because of the Filigree Angel, we were playing border posts as part of our mana base. There was, despite the fact that Esper was a shard and artifacts are what they did, nobody was playing a lot of artifact removal. So playing artifacts that functioned as lands and sometimes gave us something to do on turn 3 if we weren't trying to fit a tap land into our curve, I'm fine with that. Play 8 of those guys. I'm cool with that. And yes, I just referred to, you know, giant chunks of rock depicted as artifacts, as guys, because what do you want from me? But they would count toward Filigree Angel. They would count for, well, mainly they counted for Filigree Angel, or they would return to the battlefield. There were easy discards for Sphinx of Lost Truths because they would return to the battlefield if you resolved your Open the Vaults the next turn. And, you know, hard casting them on turn 3 wasn't the worst thing in the world. If you don't know, the border posts had 2 costs. You could either pay the cost in the upper right, which was 1 and then 1 of each of the colors that they made. So like Field Mist border post made a blue and a white. Mist Vein border post made a blue and a black. Or blue or a black, rather. Blue or white or blue or black. And the alternate cost was to pay 1 of anything, or 1 generic, and bounce a basic land you controlled to your hand in order to put the border post onto the battlefield. And the border post always entered the battlefield tapped. But playing it for full retail, playing it for 3 mana on turn 3 wasn't the end of the world, because it meant some percentage of the time you'd be able to just curve out on them and be able to Sphinx on turn 4 and to Open the Vaults on turn 5, gain, you know, 12 life, because you cycled on turn 1, gain 12 life, and just have a board, you know, whatever. It was a powerful thing to do. It gave, and what it did was a very subtle thing. Now, it was not favored in the head-to-head with the other blue-white tap-out control deck. But it was so good, it offered the same kind of advantage against every deck that blue-white control was good against. Arguably a better advantage. Like, it was better against those decks than regular blue-white was, but it was worse against blue-white than the mirror, than just playing a version of the mirror was. Which should go without saying. Like, the actual cards in blue-white were a lot more powerful individually. And once they knew that Open the Vaults was your trump, they could just board into negate. And you didn't have that option because their trump was Baneslayer Angel. Like, that's not good for you. But what the deck did is it gave us the opportunity to do the same thing that the blue-white control deck was doing. Draw cards and survive the early game, reset the board on turn 4, and then set up a scenario where we could turn the corner on turn 5 and 6. It's fundamentally the same deck, but we did it in a different way. And in Brett's hands, Brett was rusty as could be playing Magic, because he'd been, you know, high school senior, and in my time, he'd been in college. He was working really hard on his nursing degree, and he had gotten rusty. Hadn't played a lot of Magic. But, you know, I invited him out to an F&M with me, and then the next weekend we went and played a win-a-box. A free entry win-a-box at the local level. That was unheard of, and we had to do it. I played Jund at both things because it was, one, the deck I was the most comfortable with, and two, if I was going to have to, if Brett was going to be playing Rusty, he needed to play a deck that was just a little bit more powerful than... He needed to play a deck that was a little bit easier to play, let's be real. Hit land drops, don't die, do dumb stuff. That was Open the Vaults. It was also blue-white control. Hit land drops, don't die, do dumb stuff. Just what the dumb stuff was a lot different. And it was a meaningful difference. It allowed us to do the same things that blue-white control was doing on a budget without feeling like we were playing a worse version of blue-white control. Strictly speaking, we were, because in the mirror you were a dog. But you didn't compromise your matchups against the field in order to do that. So, I guess the biggest thing I can tell you, long-term, the biggest lesson I can give you about this deck, always keep an eye out for something like that. A really good example has already happened this year. We had the evolution from Sultai mid-range to Sultai Dreadhorde. Because Sultai mid-range was already so hyper-focused on value, loading the graveyard, using cards like Find and Finality to get your cards back, trigger your effects again. You know, Golgari Finebroker was sometimes played in order to buy back your Planeswalkers. But, you know, Find and Finality in conjunction with Hydroid Crisis was really powerful. And then somebody figured out this card, Command the Dreadhorde, was really powerful at 6 mana. It's arguably the most powerful thing to do in Standard at 6 mana if you set it up correctly. And then what you would end up doing is you would end up getting a whole bunch of permanents out of your graveyard. You'd get dinged down to a fairly low life total, but then you would gain a whole bunch of life back. Does that sound familiar? The difference fundamentally being that Sultai Dreadhorde is actually a mid-range deck. But this was a deck that was perfectly... Open the Vaults was perfectly happy. Like, if it had to slow roll you to the late game and just hard... Like, it could do the hard cast Filigree Angel, gain 3 life, and go on the beatdown plan. And frequently against Jund, it would actually board out 1 or 2 of the Filigrees, or like one of the Open the Vaults and a Filigree, in order to play 2 copies of Sphinx of the Steelwind, which was just an actual bomb against Jund because they couldn't kill it. They couldn't kill it and they couldn't block it. And it had lifelink. So like, it was really good against them. Literally every piece of removal their deck had that could target a creature could not kill Sphinx of the Steelwind because it had protection from green and black. So, you know, this was a deck that we've been trying to kind of reinvent many times over the years. We've been trying to find a deck that scratched the same itch, and we never really have, like, the same way. We've never found a version of a tap-out control deck that got to play this almost combo-like finish. The closest I came was playing Jeskai Cat during Aether Revolt Standard. And we never really found anything that quite scratched that same itch. Because we've never found another deck that was both cheaper and potentially better against the field than the best control deck in the format. I don't think I'm ever going to have that happen again. It was super sweet. You know, let's not let the why we played it or the lessons we can learn from it get lost in all of this. That deck was a blast to play. I mean, You're playing against mono red, and they're like, you know, they're goblin guys. Like, mono red was a turn 3 deck sometimes during that format. That was a thing you could do. There were builds of mono red that would just kill you on turn 3 sometimes. You'd go turn 1 Goblin Guide, turn 2 Plated Geopede, turn 3 fetch land, mountain, float 3 mana, cast Devastating Summon, sacrifice all my lands to make 2 3/3s, and then cast a Goblin Bushwhacker with Kicker, kill you. Like, that's a really fast deck. So being able to get, you know, Spreading Seas could help throw that curve off a little bit. Make it a little bit harder for your opponent to cast something that costs double red on turn 2, like a Searing Blaze or an Ember Hauler. Wall of Omens just blocked Goblin Guide real good, and it would, you know, Goblin Guide would help draw you through lands off the top of your deck. It was essentially like paying 2 life to make sure you didn't flood out. That was pretty cool. And then, you know, you would catch up. Inevitably, you would catch up. They'd get on the board really hard, and you'd just have the Day of Judgment, or you'd, you know, play the extra wall to survive an extra turn to find the Day of Judgment. And then they start to rebuild. They start, you know, okay, well, I'm going to find this other creature, and I'm gonna get on the board again. We're going to be ready. And then you'd play Sphinx, and they couldn't attack through it. Like, they could attack through it. It was possible. But they were like throwing a bolt at it and trading their Goblin Guide for it, which was then going to draw me a land. So that's not good for them. And then we just open the vaults on 6 and get back Filigree Angel and go back to 18, and they just lose. Like, the number of games I won where I was at 5 or less life before I resolved open the vaults against mono red were pretty staggering. Like, it was just an absolute blast to play. You had a very clearly defined plan in every single matchup, with the lone exception of your control matchup, which was abysmal. Actually, I take that back. Your blue-white control matchup was abysmal. Your blue-black control matchup was pretty good, because blue-black control was not good at the time. We had Doomblade as a draw to blue-black, and then we had cards like Agony Warp, Counter Squall, Consuming Vapors, Gatekeeper of Malakir. That's what you were playing in blue-black. It's not very good. Like, your man land, your creature land in Creeping Tar Pit was just not quite as impactful as a Celestial Colonnade. It was faster, but it wasn't as impactful. That didn't stop me from playing it later, but that's a whole other story for a whole different day. But it was a deck that was incredibly fun to play. It was way more powerful than it had any right to be, given the low amount of money that I spent on it. And it was a deck that I really wish we'd discovered a whole lot sooner in that format, because we would have played it until we couldn't. Like, I really wish we had discovered that sequence of, you know, because the craziest part about it is that, like, we could have played that deck much, much sooner. Sphinx of Lost Truths, I believe, came out in original Zendikar. So we could have played a variation on that deck much sooner. I think Wall of Omens was in World Wake. Spreading Seas was in Zendikar. So, like, when World Wake dropped, we could have played that deck, and I just never thought to look for it. And it's not that's not a mistake I'm going to repeat. I'm definitely never going to miss out on something like that again. I'm definitely going to keep an eye out for a deck like this. It's what drew me to the Guild Gates deck. Has a very similar feel to it. Catching up behind Archway Angel. It's actually something I may eventually revisit. I don't know for sure. But, you know, the basic premise behind it was to be a version of a deck that was already there in the format. That was just a little bit different. It was but fundamentally it was the same. And that's the biggest point I need to drive home out of this. We didn't try to reinvent the wheel. We just took what we knew was good against Jund and Mythic and Mono Red, and we adapted it based on what was available to us from a budgetary constraint. We didn't play worse cards with the intention of getting the better cards later. We played a version of the deck that was as complete as it could be and was just enough different that it was maybe a little bit better against what we wanted to be. So, in the future, definitely keep an eye out for something like this. I mean, at this point, it kind of feels like a unicorn sighting. It's never going to happen for me again, but it's not going to stop me from watching. So, I hope you've enjoyed. I know I have. Every time I get a chance to look back and break down that deck, it's a joy. It's an absolute joy. And it might be something we can learn from right now. I don't know. The only reason I would hesitate to go down that road is the existence of Nexus and Simic Flash, which are absolute beatings for this strategy. Don't fall behind, catch up. Play big thing. Like, that's not very good against Simic Nexus. That's not very good against Simic Flash. That's not very good against Mono Blue. So, like, I can understand not wanting to do that. But I digress. I have pulled in the driveway. I have a very, very nice, steaming hot dinner waiting on me. So, I will catch every one of you this weekend, either Thursday night or Friday morning, early Friday afternoon, on this week's trip down the homeward path, where we are going to talk about just how to do things, or to do the same things in different ways. And we're going to have a lot of different deck breakdowns from over my time playing Magic. So I hope you'll come back for it, and I look forward to bringing it to you.